Welcome to Inner Compass. I'm Karen Saupe. What books do you remember reading as a teenager? Which ones really mattered to you? Was it the safe ones or the dangerous ones? Our guest today is an award-winning author of fiction for young adults who says that danger leads to growth. He'll tell us what he means on Inner Compass.
From the campus of Calvin College, this is Inner Compass, exploring how people use faith and ethics to guide them through critical issues of today.
My guest today is Gary Schmidt, award-winning author of young adult novels, receiving 2 Newbery Honors and the Prince Honor. He's also a professor of English at Calvin College. Welcome, Gary.
Thank you, Karen.
This genre of young adult literature, what distinguishes it from children's literature or adult literature? What are some characteristics?
Sure. The easy way to talk about it, this is the easy way, is that you can say that children's literature goes up to about 6th grade. Mm-hmm. And then you've got middle grade literature, which goes from, say, 5th up to about 8th or 7th. And then you think of young adult going from 9th through high school. But as soon as you say that, you realize that there's lots of bleeding back and forth between those areas, right? And you know, I mean, from your own life, I'm sure, that there are 15-year-olds who are ready to read adult stuff, but there are also 12-year-olds who are ready to read young adult stuff. And reading level by grade is always really iffy. And that's the easy way to think about it. Another way to think about it is just by what it's about. Mm-hmm. And you could say that children's literature is all about what childhood is. Maurice Sendak says there's only literature about children. Sure. And young adult literature or middle grade literature is about that experience. I mean, that's another content way of thinking about it too.
So that's, if we think about it in those terms, then it tends to be literature about teenagers, written for teenagers.
Exactly, exactly right. Though not excluding adults. I mean, a good read is a good read, and an adult should be able to read a novel written for a 4th grader and still find it satisfying. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. So you read Charlotte's Web, say, and an adult should weep at the end equally with a 10-year-old. Mm-hmm. At least, hopefully.
and so a lot of teenage or young adult literature then is going to deal with things that are of concern to teenagers, which tend to be sort of the trauma and the turmoil of moving out of childhood and toward adulthood, right?
Absolutely, where you move away from all the safe world and the secure world where parents are making calls, or where a community is making a call for you, and then suddenly you are the guy or the woman who is trying to make the call yourself. And yeah, that is really traumatic. And that's why so many people, and we all know them in our culture, never make that, where you have people who remain perpetually adolescent because you don't want to be making that call, or certainly you don't want to be a real adult. And yeah, there is a lot of trauma in going from the safety over here to the responsibility and insecurities of young adultness, if that's a word. Yeah.
And there have been for hundreds of years coming-of-age novels. But the idea of young adult as a separate genre or a distinct genre is a fairly new category, and when you and I were teenagers, I think it was just beginning to come about.
Yeah, absolutely. And remember the problem novels? Remember that was the phrase that was used. Yeah. And there's like Robert Peck and Robert Cormier, Richard Peck, not Robert Peck. Chocolate War. Salinger was put into that category.
That was one of the, would you say that's one of the first that sort of took hold as a teenage novel, The Catcher in the Rye?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the novel that you start with when you think about this field. And also the novel that, of course, is so often censored. It's still one of the most censored books in America, 30, 40 years after the writing. Just an amazing thing that it's still so censored.
And yet, I think that was written in the late 50s, and I know when I read it, it was a sort of, it wasn't something you studied in school. It was something you got hold of, and it was a bit naughty, and the language was profane, and you were kind of shocked, and that's why you read it.
Absolutely.
And I think I read it when I was 13, read it again when I was 18, and had an entirely different response. But then later, by the time I was teaching, it was sometimes taught. I had students who sometimes would read it on their own and want to talk about it.
Yeah. There is something healthy about that, though, where because maybe that's the first time a kid picks up a book, and it's not because parents have suggested, not because a teacher has suggested. It's not in a lot of libraries, or at least isn't for young kids. But you do it because you're just intrigued what's going on here, and you want to read it. And it might be the very first book you pick up to do that with.
And today that might be Harry Potter.
Yeah, for a young kid, it might be Harry Potter.
But then there are parents who worry, and I think maybe increasingly parents who worry then, that this kind of, I don't know, subculture of literature is maybe going to lead their children into stuff that might glorify profanity or drug use or sexual behavior that's inappropriate. As a writer of young adult fiction, how do you respond to those worries?
Well, there's a long history of them. I mean, the claim that Red Riding Hood is a story that incites wrong and sexual passion is a claim that was made in 1803. Oh. And now here we are 200 years later, and no one can even imagine that.
It seems so tame.
It seems so tame in comparison. So there are really two ways to think about it. On the one hand, it is the case that books about growing up, the coming-of-age novel, if you would, of course they're sort of difficult for parents to do because it's their kiddo growing up and encountering things without necessarily an adult supervision, where here is one writer, one soul speaking to another, and there's no intermediary necessarily about that. And so, of course, that's sort of threatening. It is a vain thing to try and keep all those things away from kids, as we know from our own experience. I mean, I had my pastors to preach against The Exorcist. I remember that so vividly when it first came out. And of course,
it immediately made you want to go read
Monday
it.
Monday morning,
Yeah.
I was down at McLean's drugstore and I bought the book on the way to school, kept it because I thought it was a dirty book or something. I didn't want anyone to know. Read it that night, a couple nights, and you know, it is what it is. It's a book with a lot of iffy words in it and not a great story and not particularly well written, but I was so intrigued by it. But there are, now that's on one side, and it's certainly the case that if kids are going to grow up and look towards adulthood, they have to be able to make responsible decisions, and you have to do that. That means you're going to make some mistakes.
Sure.
On the other hand, it does seem to me that young writers for young adults have to recognize that they are, if they're serious about the craft and they really are trying to make a statement to kids, then you have to be responsible in terms of the kinds of statements that you're making. And if your statement is, go ahead and be a voyeur, I have a problem with that.
And you, when you write for this audience, and this has become sort of a specialty for you, what are you thinking of as your goal or your purpose? I mean, you're talking about the sense of responsibility.
Yeah.
What do you hope to do for your reader, or is that how you think of it?
Well, first thing, and you have to start here, is just let's have a good story. I mean, people say that you write the story that you would want to read, and I like that. There's something in that. I do write the stories that I want to read, and sometimes I write the stories in a place because I want to imaginatively inhabit that space for the writing time.
You mean the setting, the time?
The setting. So First Boy is set in New Hampshire, in part because it's a political thriller and it's primary time, and so it all, New Hampshire. And yet the other, maybe even the bigger reason, is that I just wanted to inhabit imaginatively a dairy farm in New Hampshire.
Okay.
I really wanted to live there when I wrote the book.
What
so
seems to me to be how children write stories when they're young. They make up stories about people they'd like to be and places they'd like to visit and so forth.
Or places they know.
So maybe that connects to them.
The school burns down. The most popular kid story written by a kid. I mean, how many times
right.
you burn down the school and the teachers are in flame and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, absolutely. We inhabit those places we love.
Okay. Yeah. So you start with a good story.
Start with a good story. Start with interesting and interesting characters. Why would I care about these characters? What makes them tick? Why do I want to turn the page? Why do I care enough to wonder at page 15 what will happen to this kid at page 240? And I think to create that interesting character seems to me to be really, really important. And I think maybe a third thing is to think seriously about a kind of narrative arc that shows someone maturing. I don't think you necessarily have to have that in adult literature, nor do I think you necessarily have to have that in children's literature. But I think in middle grade and young adult literature, it really is about maturation and how I move from here to here.
So you're trying to sort of lead or guide your readers or suggest patterns?
Maybe show more. Here's one pattern or one narrative arc that takes a kid from this to that. I worry about lead or guide because it starts to sound didactic. And as soon as you start to say, oh, thou reader, thou must follow, or a good thing for you to do would be to follow this path, I mean, then you're dead, because it's just boring.
Well, I have to ask you this, though. One of the first books I remember you doing for younger readers was Pilgrim's Progress.
Yeah.
That was an adaptation of Pilgrim's Progress. That's about as didactic as it gets.
That is, but if you compare the two of them, the original, and you'll see what happens, that a lot of the didacticism was dropped out. You have to drop out a lot just from the get-go. All the anti-Catholic stuff has to go. And he doesn't enjoy, Bunyan doesn't enjoy the scenes that have the most narrative potential for a child today. Right. So, for example, the battle with Apollyon, it's just bang, just like that in the original. But I really lengthened that. Oh yeah, because it's so cool. I mean, it's a two-faced demon who's facing you, and you've got a sword, you've got armor in your front, but not in your back. I mean, it's really a really cool kind of scene. And if you just whip through it, then I think your kids are going to be, I mean, I was disappointed. I always like to see it.
When you read that as a child, and so those had to be areas where your imagination took hold and you wanted more.
Absolutely.
And so your storytelling.
And what's so neat about when you do read as a child, and I'm sure you had the same experience, is that when you recall it as an adult, you don't just recall the story, but you recall the whole context.
Your interaction with it.
I mean, where you were.
Right.
Maybe it's Aunt Helen reading the story. Maybe it's your first grade teacher, and you've got a carpet square you're sitting on, and suddenly it's the smell.
I remember chocolate bars. I read a whole bunch of Mark Twain, all the Tom Sawyer books.
With chocolate bars?
I read them in a row one summer with chocolate bars.
See, I mean, it's a whole constellation of events that come back up to us. And I think, so when you mention Pilgrim's Progress, I see myself immediately. I'm like 14, and I'm up in the Catskill Mountains, and I am in a field, and I've got this book, and there are hawks flying above on these high thermal winds. I'm immediately right there. And I'm not sure that's true for me with the book I read last summer, but it for sure is true for them.
But you hope it will be for a book that you wrote last summer.
I hope so.
For your readers.
I hope so.
So some of the messages that come out in these coming-of-age novels inevitably are first encounters with difficult choices and difficult experiences, maybe drug use, sexuality, rape, parents messing up. There's a lot of young adult literature in which parents are fools or adults can't be trusted. One of the reasons that the Chocolate War, Cormier's The Chocolate War, was so controversial is that the adults are utterly untrustworthy.
Yeah, and powerless.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So all that stuff it's dangerous. And
Absolutely.
When teenagers read that without anybody to talk to about it.
But that's how most of us do read. I mean, if you think, for a kid who's a reader, it's a rather small percentage of books are the ones that a teacher has chosen for her. But in fact, are the ones that she or he goes out to find, where there is no large context. So I'm always a little nervous about this notion that, well, we can give you this book, but you'll of course have a teacher or an adult context around it. Because for most readers, very few books are read like that. I mean, I hardly remember any of those books that I had to read. Though? Yeah, on the one hand, but on the other, it is sort of a growing experience. If I have to do this myself, I mean, I remember reading Jane Eyre as a young teenager, forced to read it. I remember nothing at all of the discussions, but I remember loving it, and I remember being ashamed to admit, I mean, a teenage guy, that you love Jane Eyre, but I did. The story, of course, is fantastic, but I think that's a healthy thing to do, to have to kind of wrestle on your own with that, as most readers will do.
Do you think they will? That's what I wonder, and I think that's what maybe scares a lot of parents, is the thought that children will just read and take it in and become whatever the book tells them to become.
You know, yeah, that's the typical thing where you're worried that this book has, Harry Potter has witchcraft,
so everyone will become
a witch.
Yeah.
But our own experience tells us that that's not true, that that's the kind of straw man that's put out there. But there aren't kids who are suddenly buying cauldrons and, you know, throwing lizards into them or something. I mean, that's just not happening. And I think that that's true for most of the problematic books. Now, of course, are there going to be moments? Of course. There was that one book years ago that had, it was a film, where there was a scene with kids who would lie down in the road at night on the yellow lines and lie straight, and they would let traffic go by them. I think it was a film, and it was for them a stitch, you know, really, really funny. And that did lead.
Right, there
were cases of kids that did that. And so, of course, but I think normally a kid who is who's going to pick up a book, I mean, it's just not going to get on a broom and jump out the window. I just don't see that.
Well, and there is some, I mean, Harry Potter, okay, so there are kids who want to dress up as witches or try to play the game. And
to be the characters.
But then it's play. And
maybe
maybe that happens it does happen even from young childhood. You read about Captain Underpants and want to become Captain Underpants.
Absolutely. And, you know, or in our day, it was Cowboys and Indians. You'd go see a Western.
Yeah.
I loved John Wayne Westerns. I loved them. And we would go around and play, and we would be good guys, bad guys. But I mean, that doesn't, I think, lead to, I mean, and you grow up.
I had an experience when I was in 9th grade. I got one of the paperback books off the spinner rack in the back of the English classroom. It was called The Summer of '42. And I picked it because it had an attractive boy on the cover, and I started reading. My father picked it up and read it. My mother at breakfast said, "Is that your book?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "Where'd you get it?" And I said, "School." She said, "Your dad was up all night reading it and wants to talk to you." Oh, okay. And I wasn't far enough into the book to know that it would be about this young man's loss of innocence to an older woman. And Dad, God bless him, said, "Have you finished the book?" And I said, "No." And he said, "When you finish it, we need to talk because there's stuff in that book that is not true." And it was one of the most embarrassing and important conversations I ever had with my dad.
Wow.
But he had me finish the book.
Yeah.
And I have always appreciated the fact that he took the time to read it with me rather than just reacting to it. He must have known the movie was out.
Well, imagine what a different memory that would be for you if your mother and father sat you down and said, "You may not read this book under any circumstances."
Oh, I would have finished it as fast as I could have.
And then you would not have had that talk afterwards.
But I also do remember that book, I needed some help with, because in that case, and what he told me was that there are portrayals of boys here, and maybe I was trying to understand boys. So there are portrayals here that are not honest, and you need to know what's true and what's not. But I also do remember distinctly reading The Catcher in the Rye and thinking the profanity was a little bit tiresome. Even at 13, I didn't think that was so cool. And
after a while, the F word loses its power when it's every third page.
But what about the books where there's a sort of such a heavy burden of despair? I'm thinking, Are You There, God? It's Me, Alice. Some of the Judy Blume books. There have been more recent books that are really, really dark. And The Chocolate Wars was a tough one. There's something almost brutalizing about those experiences.
It is a brutal world. In The Chocolate War, a really interesting one where you do have the difficulty of that book is the fact that the good guy with whom you empathize says the wrong thing. Don't disturb the universe. You know, just sort of stand back, let things happen, but don't ever disturb the universe. And the evil guy, the priest, who's really evil and manipulative, he's the one that says the right thing when he turns his classroom into Nazi Germany and really skewers a kid, destroys him unfairly, waits for someone to respond when no one does, till finally one little kid, just a little voice in the background, just has disdain for all of his class because he said, "You allowed me to do this. You didn't." But he's the bad guy. And so the voice is, the right response is put in the bad guy's mouth. If you don't get that, then you could finish that book thinking that Jerry Renault's line, "Don't disturb the universe," is straight. Now there's a sequel that follows where Jerry comes back and he revises that and he refuses to allow the universe, he makes the universe disturbed. He disturbs
So just
it.
in case you didn't get it as a reader, you get a sort of second chance.
There's a second sequel and it's good, but it's his attempt to sort of reverse that position. And there's a Catholic writer who's a very, very devout guy. But yeah, I mean, his point
who wants you to wrestle with the issues.
He wants you to wrestle with it. And because it's a natural response. If you're 14 and everything seems against you, one natural response is just
don't fight it.
Exactly.
I used to teach that book to 9th graders, and then their exam was an essay about whether or not we should read the book. And what many of my students said was, we should, but we have to talk about it together. Would you read us a little bit from the Wednesday Wars? There's a scene in which Holling, the main character, has just attended his best friend's bar mitzvah, his coming of age. And his father sort of challenges what that is. It means a lot to Holling, and his father sort of mocks that.
So in this case, Danny has had his bar mitzvah, and Holling is not Jewish, but he's been impressed by what's happened, and he sees that there's something real in this spiritual event that isn't just formality. His father misses that. After the service, my parents and Heather decided not to stay for the party, already starting the reception hall. When they asked if I wanted a ride, I told them I'd walk home instead, but I went to the parking lot with them anyway. As he unlocked the car, my father said, "I bet you're glad you don't have to go through something like that." "I guess I am," I said. "What do you mean, I guess I am?" he said. "Would you want to stand up there with all that stuff all over you and chant at everyone?" "It was a whole lot more than chanting at everyone," I said. "Let's get in the car," said my mother. "No," said my father. He put his arms on top of the station wagon's roof. "I'd like to know what Holling thought was a whole lot more." My stomach got tight. "He became a man," I said. "You think that's how you become a man, by chanting a few prayers? You think you can become a man by getting a job as an architect?" My father straightened. "That's exactly how you become a man," he said. "You get a good job and you provide for your family. You hang on and you play for keeps. That's how it works." "I really do think we should get in the car," said my mother. "I don't think so," I said to my father. "It's not just about a job. It's more. It has to do with choosing for yourself." "And you didn't even have to go to California to figure all that out," said my father. "So who are you, Holling?" I felt Heather looking at me. And somehow, I don't know, I thought of Bobby Kennedy, who could have made all the difference. I don't know yet, I said finally. I'll let you know. What a barrel of mumbo-jumbo, said my father. He got into the station wagon and slammed the door. My mother blew me a kiss, really. And then she got in too. And my sister got in last of all. She was smiling. I could hardly breathe. It's a conflict, obviously, between the two of them, and really important at that scene. The father there is not, he seems a creep. And from his point of view, Depression-era guy, very powerful authority figure, he gives, I mean, that's what's important. How do you get along in this world? You work hard, you get your job over. Howling wants something much deeper than that. And he knows he's not going to get expressions of love from his father. But Howling recognizes this young, that life can't be, Lord help us if it was, it can't just be earning money. And that there's got to be something bigger. And that something bigger involves maturity, involves becoming a man. But Howling has guts enough to recognize that the spiritual moment in that ceremony was real. And that he too wants something like that. And that he will go on and be a bigger man. He will have more to be a human being with, and more to be a father with, and more to be a husband with, and more to be just a man in the community with than just someone who earns money.
You end with the line, I could hardly breathe.
Yeah,
it's so difficult. And I appreciate that because it acknowledges what that feels like to be that young man. In Anson's Way, another one of your books, you've got a situation where the boy who has always done what his father tells him finds himself really faced with a dilemma between doing what his father wants and doing what he believes to be right. This comes up again and again.
I think it's a really interesting conflict that we have, and it's a generational thing. Every generation goes through it, where as we get older, our ideals perhaps get a little bit lost, and we are more aware of the demands of the practical world that are upon us, and we are ready a little bit more easily to accommodate our ideals to the demands of the practical world. But remember, I mean, we're 14, 15. We weren't willing to do that. Right. I mean, I wore an armband when I was in 6th, 7th, 8th grade to protest the war. And who am I? You know, but all my friends wore it. And we were ready to change the world back then, and we weren't willing to accommodate. And somehow we lose that, and that's too bad in a way. But that's kind of what's going on there too. There's this kid who sees, in Anson's Way, who sees incredible injustice. His father recognizes that, okay, 1730, Ireland, Little England is stuck between Catholic France, huge power, Catholic Ireland, sort of a power, can't destroy France, but we can destroy Ireland. And so in order to preserve England, he's ready to be one of the guys that destroys Ireland. But Anson, he's not ready to make that accommodation. It's still big. It's too big an injustice, and so he will not do it. And he will turn into a man who won't do it either. He will have learned from the experience. And his father learned somewhat too. I
love the fact that you know what's going to happen to your characters after the book. You know them well by the time you finished writing.
Richard Peck says that all books are unfinished portraits. You know, there's stuff that happens before, and then there's this portrait, but it's not finished, and we end. You know, and so you point. I mean, here's the kind of person this guy will become, or here's the kind of person this young girl will become. But it's an unfinished portrait. I really like that metaphor. I think he's exactly right.
There's clearly a moral universe that you work out of, and yet sometimes, well, often, realism dictates that the moral universe isn't simple, that the choice is going to have consequences, and that maybe you can't even make the choice at that point.
Yeah, and that's what gets so interesting. It's a very messy world. And I think maybe that's another good distinction perhaps between children's literature and adult literature, or young adult literature rather, where it does seem in the children's literature that the world is somewhat easier in order to think about.
It's clearer.
It's clearer, the moral choices are. And perhaps young adult or middle grade fiction really suggests that perhaps the world is a lot messier and a lot more difficult as we make decisions. And is it possible that there are two decisions, or two options, both of which might work, but which will hurt different people? There really are. And we know that as adults, clearly. But what about the first time you're a 14-year-old person and you see, wow, I do this and I hurt so-and-so, but I save, or this, and that's the way the world is. Because that's really how our decisions are. I mean, it really is not, you know, Voldemort versus Dumbledore. It really is complication versus complication, and I think that's something worth exploring in children's and young adult books.
And maybe if we do that in hypothetical ways or vicariously through literature, we're a little bit better equipped for dealing with the tensions of reality, right?
There's this amazing book, Monster, by Walter Dean Myers. A young kid who's on trial, and he has been in the car during he'd been in the car during a robbery in which the store clerk is killed. And this kid is trying to understand, how is this prosecutor referring to me as a monster? And at the end, he gets off because it's not clear. And then he turns to his defense attorney to hug her, and she recoils. In her eyes, he sees, she believes it. She thinks I'm a monster. It's an incredible, incredible, powerful read. And yeah, I mean, that's one of the questions that you ask. The world is not so simple.
And so those kinds of endings really dump it all in our laps as readers.
We as readers are forced to ask very difficult questions, and a good book should leave you with that. I mean, I'm always happy when I get to the end of a book and instead of just closing it and saying, no more to build on there, when you start to say, wow, I mean, this makes me rethink things, that strikes me as a good read. I mean, books should always end with questions for young adults.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you, Karen.
My guest today has been Gary Schmidt, award-winning author of young adult novels and professor of English at Calvin College. I'm Karen Saupe. Thank you for watching Inner Compass.